Assalamu my dudes, and welcome back to PLB Green. Today I'm heading on holiday to the Southern Highlands, which is a beautiful part of New South Wales. We're going on a field trip to collect, bring home, and then propagate various types of mosses. Stick around. I got some good stuff on this trip. Got some little ferns. I think this is Fern Moss as well. It's a moss, but it looks like fern, so it's quite good in miniature setups. Here's a larger type of the Fern Moss. I also collected some other little plants. These aren't mosses, obviously, but I can use them in setups. Pieces of wood and bark like this, with moss on them, are really easy to propagate. The bark holds moisture, so the moss survives really easily. The best part about this trip, I think, was the fact that I got so many different types of mosses. I've got these little button mosses, which I really like. Button mosses doesn't mean anything other than the fact that these are in the shape of circles or buttons. I really like these. They're not specifically resigned to one type of moss species, but when a moss spore lands on a surface, it will naturally grow out in a circular shape, and it can have this really cool effect. They look like little buttons, and I love using them. I'm starting the process of packing the moss for travel. This isn't a permanent setup, but I want the moss to survive the trip home. I put some paper towel into the bottom of some recycled takeaway containers, and I add the moss and some dechlorinated water. When I get home, I'll be packing the moss into a more permanent setup for propagation, but this is a great travel method for the moss so it doesn't lose too much moisture on the way home. I'm trying my best to put the moss together into categories. I try to keep the species together as well as I can, just to help me out when I get home. But there's no method to this other than that. I'm back home now, and I've got this large container that I got from a local hardware shop. I'm using Sphagnum Moss, which is a dried out dead moss, to line the base of the tray. Sphagnum moss holds moisture really well, so it's an excellent surface for terrestrial moss, like the stuff I collected, to grow on. Now I'm adding some horticultural charcoal, which is a really good substance to add to any setup to help reduce any bad things inside. Things like mold or bad bacteria. The charcoal will absorb these things and really help your setup in general. The last step I do before adding the moss is sprinkling in some dechlorinated water or rainwater. The reason dechlorinated water is important is because moss will die if it's exposed to too much chlorine. And I know my tap water has way too much chlorine in it, and moss will just die off and burn if it's exposed to it. So I tend to use this just rainwater. It's pretty good. Very liberal with it. The last step to propagating moss is just adding in what you've collected. When you put it into the container, it is quite important to push down the terrestrial moss into the surface of the sphagnum moss and charcoal. You want to make sure it has good contact. If it doesn't have good contact, it won't draw up moisture, and moss is all about moisture. So you've got to make sure it has great contact with whatever substance you're planting it into. I'm not really following any procedures in the planting of the moss here. I'm just trying to keep the species of the moss together. So if I think that they fit a category, I'll tend to put them close by the other versions within that category. There is no rules here. You can kind of do whatever you want, but just know that if you're trying to propagate the moss, if it has good moisture and good light, it will spread over the remaining areas of exposed sphagnum moss. Any items that aren't moss, like these small or medium-sized ferns, I tend not to put directly onto the sphagnum moss. If you don't use these ferns within a couple of weeks, they will probably not survive. So this isn't a permanent location for them. I'm just going to save them for a upcoming project. The last step I'm taking before closing up this container is just pushing some terrestrial moss onto some volcanic rock, which is really porous and holds moisture quite well. These rocks are going to be for some future projects of mine, and I just want to see if I can get the moss to continue growing over the surface of them. The final step is to close up the container. This isn't an airtight container, so I'll have to add dechlorinated water every now and then as it evaporates. And I'm going to add a strong floodlight to the container just so the moss gets enough UV to propagate and continue spreading. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time on PLB Green.